Welcome to Total Retail Talks, your podcast channel for retail knowledge.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Total Retail Talks. I'm Joe Keenan, the editor-in-chief of Total Retail, and I'm excited to be joined on today's episode by Kathy Gagliano. Kathy is the Executive Vice President of Merchandising at Books A Million, and we're going to talk to Kathy about that retailer's physical retail expansion as well as its product category expansion, some of the exciting things on the horizon for Books A Million. So, Kathy, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on today's show.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me today.
So let's get right into it. And I alluded to the fact that Books A Million is expanding. Let's start with the physical stores. You're investing in brick and mortar retail. Tell us a little bit about why now is the right time to grow that store count.
So I think, first of all, to understand why we're investing in stores today, you have to understand who we are. Books A Million is a company that is owned by the Anderson family, and the business dates back to 1917. So that's when our chairman, Clyde Anderson, his grandfather, also named Clyde Anderson, opened a newsstand built out of piano crates in Florence, Alabama. In 1917, workers were coming to Florence, Alabama to build the Wilson Dam, which was the forerunner to the TVA. And those workers were looking for news of their hometowns. So Clyde Anderson identified that opportunity and set up that newsstand to sell newspapers and broadsheets. So really from day one, our company has existed to serve communities. And now fast forwarding, here we are over 100 years later, and Books A Million has continually adapted to do that exact thing to serve our communities. You know, we've been through every version of retail. That means downtown storefronts. That means indoor shopping malls, superstores, Amazon's rise. Today, Amazon has roughly 50% of the book market, books that are sold in the United States. And then also the Borders bankruptcy, and then on to COVID. And every time the industry rationalized, we stayed disciplined. And because we're a family-owned business with a disciplined operating philosophy, we never overextended ourselves. And, you know, I think I mentioned the Borders bankruptcy. That's a really good example. In 2011, when they did go bankrupt, because we were well positioned, we were able to buy 45 locations. We still operate those locations today, and we expanded into entirely new markets. So today we operate over 200 stores in 32 states, and we did open 15 new stores this past year. So that's I think the backstory that really talks about us as a retailer in our history. And the question you posed, you know, why are we expanding into brick and mortar today? We certainly believe that in 2026, physical bookstores matter more than ever. And the model has really evolved. We're not really trying to compete on price necessarily with Amazon. That's really not a winning game. And I think it's really about what we bring to those communities that we serve today in terms of curation, community, and also culture.
So as a nearly 110-year-old company, to your point, you've seen it all, been through it all at Books A Million. So a lot of learning experience, and you've kind of stayed the course throughout that 110-year history, and it's paid off. As you've opened 15 new stores in 2025, tell me a little bit about the strategy for growth in 2026. What does that look like, and kind of where are you focusing on in terms of not only store expansion, but the format of those stores, the product mix that is going to be contained within those stores. And then, you know, that all relates back to the experience that your shoppers have when they come into a Books A Million store. Tell me a little bit about that.
Our growth strategy is deliberate, and it looks much like what it looked like this past year. So we will continue to expand in new markets. As far as just our growth strategy and a little bit more about what that looks like, first of all, we focus on mid-market, high-growth areas. A good example of that is this past year, we opened several new stores around Houston, around the Beltway. Houston is a growing area of the country, and it was also underserved in terms of book retailers in that space. Also, typically our stores are around 12 to 15,000 square feet in terms of size. So they're right size, they're productive boxes. One of the things that we have found is that we typically avoid ultra high rent, very dense areas, urban quarters where sort of the risk reward economics really just don't work very well. If you think about the type of rent that you're paying, for example, in New York City, that could be double to triple what we would pay in some of those other markets where we've identified that there is high growth. So that's a little bit just in terms of what the strategy looks like. And then as far as the size or the format of the store, one of the other questions that you asked was about product mix.
Yeah.
So in terms of product mix, in the bookstore, there are roughly 40 to 60,000 SKUs that make up really the core, if you will, book backlist. And that is really the engine of the book business. And typically, any bookstore that is in this size range, you're going to see a lot of those books represented because they are the core engine. But the differentiation really comes in terms of the curation, the point of view, the engagement with the customer in the different communities, building that community, and then also cultural adjacency and what's going on there. And really, the biggest thing that has changed over the last 5 years, 6 years now is the post-COVID customer is dramatically different in the book retail space from the pre-COVID customer. So pre-COVID, our core customer was, a 45-year-old woman, well educated, typically married with two children, college educated. Today, that has dramatically aged down. So today you've got more of an 18 to 40-year-old woman. They engaged highly during COVID. As we know, a lot of content, both book content and streaming content, really skyrocketed during COVID because we were all sitting at home. And with that and that change in that customer demographic, the bookstore has evolved along with that.
As you were talking through kind of the differences in markets, question kind of to my head in terms of as you think about the product mix, 32 states, I believe you said Books a Million has physical stores in. There's that core inventory assortment that's probably in every location. Is there some differentiation in terms of different markets? So, like, to go use the example you did, like in Houston, is that a Houston store have the exact same inventory assortment that you would have in a store in New York City, for example? Or is there some regional variation in the products that you're offering in the different stores?
There is definitely a regional variation among the stores, and a lot of that is driven by that community that I mentioned earlier. So, in terms of either things that we anticipate that those customers are going to want to see in their stores, that could be regional history books or other books that pertain to local attractions, national parks that may be nearby, or other vacation destinations. So it's really a combination of history and also cultural. And also, the other thing that we see is in fiction, if there are books that are set in areas that are around where those stores are, those books tend to over index as well. So, yes, that's definitely something that we're attuned to. Also, one of the things that is great about running bookstores, which differs some from my early part of my retail career, is that we have a lot of long-term booksellers in our stores, much like we do with our buying team. And a lot of that has to do with personal passion
Yeah.
and affinity among book lovers. So this is not just a part-time job. This is a true calling. And those are people that also are in our stores. They know a lot about books. They share their passion with customers and with each other and with me when I'm in the stores visiting with them. And that is really something that is a source of pride for us and something that helps us to really deepen those connections in the communities that we serve.
Yeah, it's that experience that you talked about in your previous answer, Kathy. One of the things I wanted to get into is that Books a Million really is been credited with identifying cultural trends, kind of the manga explosion being one example, before they really hit peak mainstream. Tell me a little bit about how your team spots some of these mainstream hits early and the processes you're using to validate them before, investing in inventory based upon some of these cultural trends.
So I would say that first and foremost, we do identify trends early. And as I mentioned, I think that a lot of that has to do with our team and the personal passion that the team has for the categories that we sell. So, with our core business being books and also the adjacent products that we sell in our stores around that. And I think that we're fast and we're very entrepreneurial. And because we're family owned, we don't have 5 or 6 layers that we have to go through to get approval to do that. So that helps us to be very nimble and to be responsive to what we believe our customers are looking for in our stores, and sometimes maybe even before they know that they're looking for it. I think that if you pay attention to customer behavior, you see inflection points before they're obvious necessarily in the headlines. That includes everything from larger sort of macro cultural shifts to things like the fashion runways, street style, things that we're seeing on social media. And then also reviewing pop culture to really see what ideas are gaining traction, looking at or attending multiple different types of events. Sometimes being in places where you aren't normally at will allow you to see new ideas or understand different ways of thinking about the business that become important. And, just to give you one example, I think back to, I mentioned COVID and what a dynamic change that brought about in our business. But even pre COVID, for example, there was a lot going on in the graphic novel space, and this was related to Marvel and also DC and what was happening in that space. Around 2021, we began to see superhero content. It was showing signs of oversaturation. If you think back to that time period, Marvel and the Marvel Cinematic Universe had this rapid expansion into Disney Plus, the streaming there also with theatrical releases. And then on the flip side of that, DC was facing issues with this fragmented release strategy that they had. But if you contrast that around the same time, manga and anime were accelerating rapidly. And, thinking back to that time period, first of all, Demon Slayer, which continues to be an extremely strong license today, was the highest grossing film worldwide in 2020. And then also in 2020 and coming out of that time period, Netflix had aggressively licensed anime content. And during COVID 20 and 21, they really exposed an entirely new audience that had not really been in that space to via streaming. And also Crunchyroll, who was really more of an indie that was bringing that content to a group of consumers, really began to surge. So we leaned into that growth early. We already had previously over indexed into manga, but we were well positioned as it scaled into the mainstream and were able to take advantage of that, both from setting, for example, an animation domination section in our brick and mortar stores that really capitalized on the content that was being brought into the streaming content because we're really the original source with the books, but then also bringing along collectibles and other products that we thought that consumer would be interested in.
And I imagine that would align to your point earlier about the shift in the customer, right? That younger customer that's now post-COVID. I would imagine they're showing a higher affinity for those types of products, those types of books.
They are showing a higher affinity. And one specific thing around anime and manga, the books, that was so interesting was we also saw further reach by the female demographic that had not been there previously. So, as I mentioned, we've got this burgeoning 18 to 40-year-old female customer. And really during, the rise of this social media, this is really the group that begins to influence other readers that come into the fold. So it really turned the marketing on its head because you've got this viral online community really rising off of TikTok and Book Talk in particular that began to drive specific genres within books. And that really led with what became known as romantasy, which previously in the science fiction world, we did not have romance. It was a side story, but it became the main or central story with these strong female characters. That was really the beginning of where we saw that trend. Most recently, we're seeing that move into horror.
So I want to get your perspective as EVP of merchandising. I want to get your take on how you think about balancing data-driven decision making, kind of the feedback you're collecting from your customers, but also balancing that with your instincts as a merchant, right? Tell me a little bit about that kind of thought process, particularly as you're doing kind of demand forecasting and making inventory decisions on a longer term basis, maybe 6 months out, up to a year out? How do you kind of balance that data versus your kind of gut instinct as well?
Well, it definitely has to be both. And part of my background in retail is in planning. So I love numbers. And we do watch the fundamentals closely. Things that I think, all good retailers watch, whether that be sell through, transactions, comp store sales, profitability. Because if those things aren't working, quite frankly, nothing else really matters. So the thing about data is that while data can sometimes identify opportunities, it doesn't always tell you what's about to happen, especially with the increased tempo of change that we're seeing today. 10 years ago, I could literally see a trend moving across the United States. I could see things that were beginning to happen in stores on the West Coast, and we could watch some of those as they moved across the nation. Now, with the rise of technology and the rise of media and social, that's no longer the case. We're moving much faster. So I think we test early in small ways. We do use merchant instinct, as I mentioned earlier, time that we spend in stores, not only with our teams, but also with customers and at events. We use those data points to interpret culture and help us to identify and create our next opportunity.
So we've talked primarily about, as you would expect, books in terms of books of millions business, but there are ancillary product categories that you're in as well. I want to get your take on how you think about merchandising in a way that blends obviously your core product books, but also lifestyle products, collectibles, these community driven categories that can boost incremental growth and be complementary to your core business of books.
We see ourselves in the entertainment space. And to your point, and as we mentioned earlier, the core book assortment is the engine, but it's the differentiation that happens around that. Earlier in my career with Books a Million, I spent roughly 9 years running our gift division. So I have a lot of experience in understanding and changing that to match what we really saw as what our customers were interested in and what was well aligned as they were coming into our stores. So I think when you think around the passion and the community around bookstores, things like that romantasy reader that I mentioned earlier, they may want special editions of books, but they're also looking for collectibles or other lifestyle products that go along with that. A manga reader connects to anime. They also will buy volume after volume of the books. They're also looking for collectibles and other items that will go along with that. Initially during COVID, because we were all closed in and we were at home, that was a time period when home decor was really on the rise. And we were seeing people want to, decorate, for example, their desk. Once we really moved and people became very interested in moving and getting out of their homes and moving into going out and attending events, for example, that really we saw a movement there into things that demonstrated basically personal fandoms, things that they were interested in. That could be anything from a Loungefly tote bag that expresses your point of view on, a product that or a license that you're a fan of, to a t-shirt or maybe other swag that you would wear to show that fandom, and also to help self-identify because you may be around somebody else that is a fan of that property as well. And that goes back to that community that we're talking about. I think one of the collaborations that we did this past year was with Pop Mart. Pop Mart has been opening flagship stores in the United States in major metros. But as of this past year, we're one of their two largest distribution partners, the other one being Urban Outfitters. And I think that they chose us because we are strong in these mid markets that we serve, but also our customers were aligned from a cultural standpoint. And that product sits right alongside the fandom that is driving a lot of our book sales. And we also know that we have a high attachment rate in terms of when customers come into our stores because they know we have new Pop Mart drops. They're putting other items, including books, into their basket.
Yeah, I was going to say that these complementary products can help drive increased basket size, right?
Yes, absolutely. So while we are merchandising books in the stores, much like you would expect in any bookstore where you've got alpha by author, those types of things, often we are bringing out and curating statements in our stores that show that passion. So going back to that book talk customer, that literally started several years ago. It was one end cap in our stores. Today, if you walk in, you're going to see a special section of the store that's carved out for that customer that has several feature tables and also 5 to 6 in sections that speak to the different core audience that we know is really in that romantasy group that we were talking about earlier.
So I'll close with this question, Kathy, as we're speaking to our audience of retailers. Are there any lessons, any pieces of advice you might share based on your experience from Books A Million and this path that you've been on that could help our audience? They might be outside of the book vertical, but they're also in the retail industry. So any kind of words of wisdom you might be able to share?
First of all, I would say that I think that discipline creates opportunity. There were times because we didn't overextend ourselves that then we were able to expand when other competitors were collapsing. That also goes along with our ability to identify early trend and be a early mover in particular markets. Second of all, I think that you need a reason to exist beyond price. And for us, that's really about that curation, that community connection, and also that culture. And then I mentioned earlier, and I think staying close to your customer is really important. When the demographic shifted post-COVID, we leaned into that. We quickly pivoted and we developed a framework and a structure that we could work around. And then also finally, and I think really most important for us, and I've mentioned this several times earlier while we've been talking, is people. Investing in our people. We have leaders that work for us from 15 to 30 plus years, but that's also alongside next generation in-house talent that's really bringing new tools and perspectives. And that's the same in our stores as it is here at our corporate and home office. And I think that's really been all of those things combined, a winning combination for us.
Yeah, it certainly has been. And I want to take the opportunity to thank Kathy Gagliano, the Executive Vice President of Merchandising at Books A Million, for telling us about that retailer's story, as well as a little bit about its 2026 strategy. So, Kathy, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thanks for listening. For more information on this podcast, please check out our podcast channel page at mytotalretail.com/podcasts for show notes. Total Retail Talks is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe on our podcast channel page as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a few moments to rate and review this podcast. Thanks, and until next time, this has been Total Retail Talks.